All right, record to this computer. All right, and it looks like I got a couple of people that are in the room. Audio is working. Cool, thank you very much. All right, I can't promise that I won't make more technical errors as we go through the semester. But we'll try to keep it to a minute. Whoops. As I'm saying that, I can't click on things properly. All right, I'm going to show you my rundown here really quick when I start. So I have a couple of diagrams on here. So today I want to talk about the cultural landscape. This is a really important concept for me as a geographer. It's kind of my field of study, I guess you could say. I'll talk a little bit about what that means and kind of how it is a kind of lens that I use to look at the world, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that kind of background stuff in geography, kind of philosophy and definition stuff. Just so you get a sense of like how I look at geography, how I look at environmental justice in particular, because I'm designing your guys' projects, and it helps if you can get inside my head a little bit to know what I want and what I'm looking for. Once we do that, I'm going to introduce another, kind of feeding off of that, what we'll talk about on Wednesday is what I call the racist box. All right, and I'll talk about what that means, but it's going to feed off this idea of the cultural landscape, right? Yeah, and then we'll take a little break. Second half of class, I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by the racist box, and then I'll go over our first project, which I published on Canvas. You can take a look at it and get started. You will be working on that, or have some time in your discussion section on Friday to work on that. But I want to run down that assignment with you and walk you through the steps. It's more or less what I showed you the other day, but I have some detailed instructions, and I want to go over the question prompts so you know kind of how to do the project and turn something in. So yeah, that's kind of the plan. I will try to miraculously talk for an hour and then take a break, but I'll probably go longer today before I take a break, just because I'm looking at maps and I get carried away. Start off, I kind of got into geography because I was sick and tired of people asking me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I couldn't come up with an answer. I wanted to be just about everything you can imagine, and I tell a few different stories on how I became a geographer. You'll probably hear them throughout. I slept with a globe when I was a kid instead of a teddy bear. That's real. I had to actually replace the globe because I rubbed the Alps off of Europe. Yeah, so maybe I was born to be a geographer. But through some other circumstances, I ended up an art major and then a biology major in political science. And I ended up stumbling into the geography department one day, and they were protesting out in front. There was some, like, the university was buying their merchandise from sweatshops in the Philippines or something. And so the geography students were the ones protesting, and I was like, oh, those might be my kind of people. And then I walked inside, and then there were like really kind of book nerdy looking people, you know, with the pocket protector, and they were sitting in front of computers playing what I thought was SimCity. And I was like, hippies and nerds? It's definitely my people. And when I became a geography major, I found out like it's perfect for people like me that couldn't ever decide what they wanted to be. Geography comes from the Greek words geo for earth and graph to write. It's literally writing about the earth. So when you become a geographer, you don't have to pick what you want to study. You can change all throughout your career. I thought that was magical. And I was like, wow, for the first time, I get to call myself what I think I am, which is everything. I just want to be everything. I want to do everything. Now, the crappy part came when I got deeper into geography, and they're like, okay, what kind of job do you want to get? And I was like, wait, this ends with me not being in college and I have to get a job. So I kept going to college. And somewhere down the line, you know, somebody's going to say, okay, you're a geographer. What's your specialty? And I just always hated that. Like, I've done a whole bunch of different stuff. I've been an urban planner. I worked in ecological restoration. I worked with environmental nonprofits. I worked with nonprofits that play soccer. So I've done sports. I've done media framing analysis. So I look at newspapers, journal articles, books. I can watch TVs and movies for some of the research I've done. I'm interested in geoarchaeology. I'm interested in mycology. I can't decide, right? So geography is perfect. But over the years, and after much pestering from people who decided that I needed to have an answer to that question, I decided I'm a cultural ecologist, right? And if you ask a geographer, they'll laugh because that's kind of a cop-out too, because that's kind of mixing physical side of geography and the human side of geography, right? So what they really want is for you to say if you're a human geographer or a physical geographer. I just couldn't pick. Cultural ecology is kind of an older field within geography. Most of the time you hear people call themselves political ecologists now. For a lot of reasons I don't have to get into, which, well, you guys know about old heads and new heads, right? Call sour's like old head stuff. It's for people who don't listen to music that's on Spotify, right? And political ecology is like on Spotify. So all the cool geographers are calling themselves that. So what that means basically is that I look at the world, or I look at human culture as a relationship between people and their environment, right? What is the environment? How does it influence us in our culture, right? And you guys think about a way that the environment influenced you today in your decision making, your relationship with others. It's beautiful out today, so you don't have to think about it that much. What about when we left class last week? Well, we stuck around and chatted for a while. Yeah, the sky broke open and it rained, and I left my rain jacket in my office, right? So it's kind of easy to see how the environment has an influence on us personally, right? I mean, we take all those decisions. I know you guys like live without worrying about what the weather is. I had a student years ago in a physical geography class. They had to do like a weather journal, keep track of how the weather influenced them. And this student was like, I wear a t-shirt and shorts every day, no matter what. And this is in Colorado. And I was like, okay, we'll see. Broke down on one day that we had a snowstorm and wore pants, right? But I put that challenge out there. I was like, you're all influenced by the environment. And this student was like, nope, I don't care. I don't even look out the windows. Yeah, so it's kind of easy to see how the environment influences us, right? Just down on those kind of like material levels, what kind of clothing you have to wear. Just for background, too much information. I'm having trouble regulating in the humid climate out here. So like if you see me, I'm glowing and I may have like pit stains. I come from a dry climate, so like this humid stuff is hard to deal with. We think about how human beings influence their environment. That one's easy too. When's the last time you chopped down a tree? I did it a few weeks ago, but I do that sort of thing. Right? Everything we do has an impact on the environment, right? Just breathing out CO2, you're contributing. Like my lectures are a huge contributor to climate change. I was just like hot air, CO2 out in the atmosphere. So it's easy to think about how we might have an influence on the environment, right? But it obviously gets a lot more complex than that. And so in cultural ecology, we think about things like how does a human culture arise from the environment, right? And not just the clothes we wear, but how we look at the world, right? The kind of lens that we use to understand the world, the things that we believe are true, right? How is that tied to the environment that our culture arises in? So all big picture stuff. Now, Carl Sauer was kind of he's my favorite old time geographer, really influential, comes from my home state of Iowa, went to California, made his career at Berkeley. One of the things that Carl Sauer is famous for, it was just really wild stuff. Now we have genetic technology, so we can actually pull genes from plants that we eat today and compare them to wild varieties of those plants in nature. And we can figure out, you ever wonder where corn comes from? I'm from Iowa, so I think about corn like way too much of the day. Yeah, so corn actually comes from down here in Central America. It's a wetland plant. It's like a grass that's adapted to wetlands. And so nowadays we can take modern corn and test its genetics against wild varieties of grasses growing in central Mexico, and we can go, yep, And this is the wild ancestor of the corn that we eat today. The really wild thing is that Carl Sauer did this like 100 years ago. You know, flying propeller planes out into Oaxaca and landing on a field somewhere and going out and talking to people that live there. He was all over the world trying to figure out where the heck our food came from, right? And that's one of the most foundational things in modern agronomy. And when we study agriculture and geography, is the disconnect between where we grow our food. Most of the world's corn today is grown in the United States, up in places like Iowa, which aren't really adapted to subtropical wetland grasses, right? So we have this big mismatch ecologically between where we grow our food and where it originally came from. So that's just fascinating to me that the stuff we find with 21st century genetic technology, Carl Sauer found that out a long time ago by going out in the wild and finding the most biodiversity, right? So he went down to South America and was like, you guys grow potatoes? And they're like, yep, we've been growing potatoes for thousands of years. And he found where they have the most variety of potatoes, and they grow purple potatoes and yellow potatoes, and they grow weird long like fist looking potatoes, and they got like 100 different varieties of potatoes in this one part of South America. And Sauer said, well, there's a lot of diversity there, and if you were going to choose a type of potato to grow as a crop, this is probably where you do it, right? So biodiversity, he was talking about how important biodiversity was before biodiversity was even a word, right? So I think one, that's a really cool lesson for science, right? If we think that it's all high tech and you have to have training in calculus and stuff like that, I mean, it's probably helpful, but I didn't do that. And I think I haven't been nearly as successful as Sauer, but it's the pure basis of geography, right? It's based in field work. You go out into nature, you make observations, and you correlate between variables that you see are related, right? And through that, we can tease out causative effects. So, yeah, kind of a cool story about geographical science. And also, like when I was learning this in grad school, like one of my hobbies, graduate school is like really hyper competitive environment. It's like cutthroat type stuff, and really, really stressful. And so cooking was kind of one of my outlets. So I got really into world cuisine, and the really fascinating thing that I found about world cuisine is that like things taste better when they're grown together. Like, I mean, you can have almonds, and like I had almonds and dried pineapple the other day and it was fine, but like almonds and dates, they just go together like peas and carrots, right? So kind of an example of how culture, right? How the environment producing a certain amount of plant or types of plants enables the people there to create a suite of cuisine, right? Different dishes that really comes from that environment, right? And then, of course, we'll get into colonialism, where we kind of shake up the snow globe and we get wild international cuisine. You guys know that Italian food is just Asian Latin fusion. Yeah, they got noodles. They didn't have noodles in Italy until like the 1300s. And then after the Europeans come over to the New World, they bring back tomatoes. And at first they thought tomatoes were poisonous. The closest relative in Europe is nightshade, which is like toxic poison. And so anybody that messed with tomatoes were witches. It's a wild story in Renaissance Europe. Like they persecuted women for growing tomatoes, right? But these pagan women were like, these are actually food. This is good stuff. So tomatoes didn't actually enter into Italian cuisine until like well into the 1500s, 1600s. There you go. Spaghetti and noodles, Asian Latin fusion, right? So, but back to our point here, right? That's kind of cultural ecology, right? We choose from the environment what we need for our culture, right? That makes our culture different because every culture around the world has a different environment they're choosing from. Cultures move around over time, right? So we can actually track the migratory history of different cultures by looking at the material culture they bring with them, the plants they carry with them across space, right? So, and then of course, we start to think about how we influence the environment, right? So the spread of seed agriculture up into North America, for instance, this is just revolutionary. There's all kinds of older plants that used to be grown. I go off on tangents here. I'll see if I can find a picture for you. Oh, well, we know what quinoa looks like. Let's see if we can find it. All right, you might see plants that grow like this, weedy stuff. This is the wild relative of amaranth or quinoa. We call it goosefoot. They call it pigweed in Iowa because it grows all over pig confinement lots. Um, this plant was the most widely consumed plant in North America prior to the arrival of corn, right? It displaced this and turned it into a weed, right? This is an ancient domesticated crop that's gone feral because nobody really grows it anymore, right? About 3,000 years ago, corn started to come out of Central America. About 1,200 years ago, it was as far north as the Missouri River. Radical transformation. I studied prairies, right? I found out by some of this stuff because I studied tall grass prairies in the Midwest. And we would go out and like spray poison on things that we said were weeds, right? And I got really critical because one, I didn't want to use a lot of herbicide. I wanted to do like organic prairie restoration. And every guy with a chainsaw and a bucket of 2,4-D laughed at me like I was an idiot. It does work. You need a lot of people to do it. Like poisoning stuff like this, right? When I found out what the actual history of this plant was, I was like, oh my gosh, that's awful that we're poisoning this. This is a native plant that somebody domesticated 10,000 years ago and used as the major food product all the way up until corn came to the United States, right? When corn came up to North America from central Mexico about 1,000 years, maybe between 3,000 and 1,000 years ago, had a radical transformation on the way people practice agriculture and on the ecology of the grasslands that people lived in, right? They started choosing different plants from the prairie. They started growing other plants instead of the ones they used to select from, right? So a massive impact on their environment just by what they chose to grow and food for food and what they chose to leave behind. All right, so that's kind of cultural ecology in a nutshell, right? And some little diagrams here. And keep in mind this is old head stuff. So like, new geographers are like, like me when I was in grad school, I'm like, the landscape isn't detritus. It's not just the relics that people leave behind in the dirt. The landscape is active, right? So Sauer, of course, comes up with these foundational theories, and in the 100 years since, we've taken them a lot farther, right? So in Sauer's conception, it is kind of this easy equation, right? Humans plus natural landscape equals cultural landscape, right? And the cultural landscape is just this thing, it's barns and fields that just sit there, right? And what we know now is that the cultural landscape is much more powerful than that, right? It isn't just this sort of like stage upon which human activity takes place. It's an actor, right? It's almost like we created this virtual reality environment that we put ourselves in, and it continues to code our brains over hundreds of years after it's been built, right? An example of that, does that look like food to you? Right? But if I show you a cornfield, you'll be like, food comes from there, right? Because we've been coded over 1,000 years to think that planted straight rows is where food comes from. And if you make a wild garden, well, you can't get food from there. Right? So the way we landscape kind of codes our brains into thinking a certain way, right? So when Europeans came over here to the United States and saw indigenous people growing, what they considered wild gardens on the riverbanks, Europeans were like, you ever heard this Native Americans didn't practice agriculture? Yeah, that's bullshit. Because it didn't look like the way Europeans did it, right? The Europeans were like, where's your agriculture at? And Native Americans were like, right here, and here, and here, and here, right? And Europeans were like, but where's like the plowed straight rows and the fences to keep the goats out, right? So it was just a different frame of reference because that environment tends to code the way we think about the world. All right. Bring my notes back over here. All right. So as a cultural ecologist, this is all I'm about, right? Is this relationship between human cultures and the environment, right? And back and forth. It's a feedback. So let's go tour some places here, right? Farming. I know when I start talking about farming, people are just like, your eyes start getting really heavy. I'm talking about corn. and soil fertility and nematodes. Okay, yeah. I talk about farming, it really falls asleep. So let's see some examples of the cultural landscape. Really obvious ones. How many of you have been to Washington, D.C.? Awesome. It is definitely a place everybody should go once in their lives. Partly because I think it's just like a fabulous city. Like, don't get a car when you go there. Yeah, just get yourself a Metro Pass and ride subway around the whole time. You'll see tourists and cars. They have like these massive traffic circles. They're insane. Well, I can't find the one I'm thinking of right now. Yeah, but it's just awful to go drive around. Look at all these diagonal streets coming in. Yeah. All right. So it's like European. It's like the most European American city. So really cool to visit just for that. But also just kind of as an American citizen to go there, you get like, and a lot of you, I'm sure, those of you guys that have been to Washington, D.C., how many of you went on a school field trip? All right, so quite a few people. There's a reason they do that, right? And this is a didactic landscape. It teaches you, just walking around Washington, D.C., you read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, like literally engraved on the buildings, right? You walk by the Department of Justice and it has right there, right, the Bill of Rights scrawled in stone on the side of the building. So this landscape, right, is very obviously built by Americans, right? The new American government. And so think about that sense of identity, right? Where Americans were trying to like establish themselves as separate from the British, right? We won't want to be like those Europeans. So what do we do? Hire a famous European architect to design our city. I know, it's kind of a thing. When you have a chip on your shoulder, you like everybody can see it. Yeah, okay. Americans have had a chip on their shoulder for a long time. Well, for instance, Europeans, like you British people looked at Americans like, you guys were just the cowboys, you know, well, they didn't have cowboys then, but you guys were just the uncouth wilderness people, right? Out in the woods, and they started to talk different than the Europeans, right? And became self-conscious of it. If you've ever heard people from Massachusetts or people from Boston, they park the car in the Harvard Yard, right? That's because people from Boston were very conscious in the 1700s that they were talking different from people in England. So they tried very consciously to talk like people from England, right? And eventually Irish people came over and we started talking like this, right? So, yeah. So Americans being self-conscious of being in the wilderness, right? What did we do? We're going to build our capital in the damn swamp, right? So everything about this is kind of coded, right? It's reflecting culture. The visible sight lines that we have here, for those of you that have been there, right? You probably stood here in the mall in a landscape that like physically reflects the structure of the American government, right? So from this location, we can see right here from the Washington, well, you kind of have to go up the hill. I put it down in the wrong spot. Oh, well, there we go. So in one direction, we can see to the White House, right? In the other direction, we can see down towards the Jefferson Memorial. And then back in this direction, over that hill that you can't see, is the Capitol building, right? And so those sort of nested parts of American government, right? The House of Representatives and the Senate, the executive branch, right? You have the Supreme Court, which is on the other end of the mall. And so it really kind of symbolically represents the structure of American government, right? And the way L'Enfant designed this is that the Capitol is on a hill, right? You saw a little hill the Washington Monument sits on. The White House sits a little bit up on a hill, as does the Jefferson Memorial sitting up here on the natural levee of the Potomac, right? And all of these diagonal streets where you have a connection between the People's House and the President's House, right down Pennsylvania Avenue there. Right, the physical nature of the landscape reflects that the sort of way they want the culture to be, right? That sort of normative idea of American culture. So that one's fairly obvious, right? And that landscape, like many planned capitals, is designed to tell you that story, right? There's, important statuary, that explains kind of the history of the American Revolution, right? The things that Americans are supposed to believe, scrawled on the side of buildings, right? So that's kind of easy and obvious. There's another kind of wild site over here. This is one of the largest, I think it is the largest federal office building next to the Pentagon. This is the National Geospatial Intelligence Center. You know why they called it GEO-I? Well, because one, it gets all satellite information of our eyes up in the sky, right? But do you see how the building is shaped? It's kind of like an eye winking at, oh, sorry, I can't wink. All right. What do you think that piece of the landscape is saying?
Intelligence.
Who is it talking to?
Oh, other countries.
Other countries' spy satellites, right? Like we're looking at you too. Okay. Right. So yeah, the landscape speaks to us, right? And in some ways, it's very obvious. When we build monuments of slave owners, well, we don't build them. I didn't. Some people do, right? What's that supposed to say? Right? Well, it's a war hero fighting for a cause of slavery, right? So sometimes these things are very obvious, right? When we build things in the landscape, we want them to speak to you. And so monuments, government buildings, things like that are pretty obvious. Other obvious ones, you can fly over to our home right here. College campuses. You guys can fly around on Google Earth. You can go to any college campus. It looks like this. There's a quad at every college campus, right? There's our quadrangle right there. So this is also a very didactic landscape, right? I noticed this today when I walked up to Smith Hall. The doors here at Thompson are not quite as nice, but if you walk up to Smith Hall or any of the buildings in the quad, giant wooden doors, right? And if you look right where you open up, what do you see right there? Does anybody notice these details? I do. I took pictures of the light fixtures on the Walla Walla ferry. They're made out of copper. They're pendant, like mid-century modern light fixtures. I want one in my house. All right, I noticed stuff like this. All right, if you look at the doors on Smith Hall, they have these giant carved rose flowers, right? That door, I do a lot of like renovation. I grew up in a historic house. I went to like flea markets with my parents as a kid to pick out like little carved wood things that go in our house. That door is like probably $15,000 if you wanted to replace it. You're going to have to get an artist to carve it, right? You can't just order that on Amazon, right? Do you guys feel that when you're walking around campus, like how nice everything is, aside from the classrooms, which have like 1995 technology? Like, where's a freaking Elmo, you guys? All right. But yeah, the fixture, like the doors, right? The buildings, why do they have to be that beautiful? You guys, your library. You guys been in the, is it the Odegaard Library? Oh, so that's the Harry Potter library, right? Okay, yeah. It's gorgeous, right? What does that building say? Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's 100% designed like a Gothic cathedral, right? It opens up the light and allows it in. Yeah, and the Gothic cathedrals were designed that way back in like the 1200s and 1300s. One, because when Europeans went to the Arab world and found like real architects that were making flying buttresses and stained glass, and they were like, holy shit, we can make churches like this. And two, in that time period in medieval Europe, there was this kind of religious shift to looking and equating God with light and the sun, right? Again, exposing themselves to other people in the world and saying, hey, some people worship the sun. What if that's our guy too, right? And so Gothic cathedrals were meant to pierce that building with light and inspire that sense of awe, right? So like when you walk in and the light comes in and you're like, you feel like you hear angels calling, right? It's supposed to do that. Right? So then what's your reaction? What's your behavior when you walk into a space like that? How does that code your behavior?
Inspired, just like knowing you're in there. It's like, you know, like all the knowledge that I'll say, just feel inspired to do work.
That's so the way you're describing, I'm inspired by all the knowledge. So I walk in there and I go, fuck yeah, no. No, we don't do that, right? We've been coded to enter spaces like that in a different way, right? That sense of awe is like going into a church, right? And you don't walk into a church, well, there's different types of churches. Maybe some people get a little excited. Yeah.
As far as like reverence, like you want to be respectful of the space.
Absolutely. Reverence is a perfect word, right? And they built it like a church because churches have been coded that way for 1,000 years, right? We walk in, well, I was a weird kid. Maybe I am still a weird kid. And then my kid started doing this too. Every time we'd walk into a big hall, my kid would echolocate. You watch little kids sometimes when they go in a big building, they'll be like, they want to hear like, yeah, so they're echolocated. They want to know how voluminous the space is by sending information out. Yeah, but most of us, right, we don't do that. If you see a kid do that going into a church, the parents will glare down at him and be like, oh, in here, right? Yeah, so that place is built to make us feel like that, right? And we've been coded to respond that way. I didn't grow up with a lot of that coding, so I do tend to run into libraries and be like, fucking books, dude. And the librarians, my mom was a librarian. Yeah. You ever heard the term ivory tower? We got an ivory tower here, right? Every campus has a campanile, has a clock tower up on it. It's like the university god saying, you know what time it is. It's time for knowledge, right? So the whole, everything about the landscape speaks to us, and we've been coded. We have terms like ivory tower, right? Which means that all the monks are up here in the monastery on the tower looking down at all the peasants. That's actually legit where universities come from. They develop from like the monastic system. Yeah. Have you ever been to graduation before? They're all wearing like weird robes and shit with like all these coded imagery hanging down, tassels and stuff. Yeah, and you wear a funny hat. Yeah, when I graduated my PhD, I had a funny hat on and I was like walking around and my professors all came up in their robes and I was like, I've joined the cult now. All right, there were no weird rituals going on. At least that I wasn't into. One of my professors did tell me he had a bottle of whiskey in his desk. And when he was a grad student, everybody used to party together. And me and my friends were like, cool, Dr. Peak, we're going to go down to the bar, have fun. Drinking out of a bottle in your desk. Yeah, very, very coded, right? To speak about knowledge and to speak about reverence and respect. So some other places that are kind of coded that way. Oh, I can actually go. Oh, and there's no good pictures, so I'll show you my pictures. So this is a cemetery in the Amana colonies in Iowa. The Amana people are kind of, well, they're considered Anabaptist, similar to Amish or Mennonite people, a little less overtly religious and conservative. They made appliances, which is really weird and ironic, right? They're people that eschewed technology, but they gave us most of the technology that's in our house today. Yeah, washing machines, Amana appliances. So this is near where I went to get my undergrad. And one of the really fascinating things about the Amana colonies is that they were very egalitarian. They lived communally. So I can show you that here on Google Earth. Everybody lives in these little colonies, what they call them, right? So there's several of them, and they have some of the oldest architecture in Iowa. Everybody lived in town, and the community got together and decided who was going to farm, who was going to raise cattle, right? And they did that collectively and made decisions together, and everybody lived in town, and they went out, and in Middle Amana, they still have collective grazing rights in the Iowa River, right? So you can kind of get a sense of that collectivity by seeing this village, right? There aren't people living like my parents had to, and like some of you guys probably did with your Zillow. I just want to live out by myself, right? You know, they used to have a word for people that did that, right? Yeah, like hermits and recluses. All right, now everybody in society is like, I want to go be Rip Van Winkle. Live in a cave and let my beard get really long. This is cool. It's really nice living in the country. But you don't see that here in Amana, right? Everybody's living in town. So it's kind of hard to pick out that egalitarianness by looking at it, right? You can't see that organization in the fields. You don't really see that when you walk through town. But when you look at the cemetery, it becomes a lot more obvious, right? Have you seen a cemetery that looks like this before? What kind of a cemetery does it look like? Military cemetery, right? Military is the same idea. Everybody's equal. I mean, the rank thing, obviously, but like, right? Everybody's part of the same fighting unit. And so when you're buried in a military cemetery, you're buried in the order that you die in, and you get the same headstone as every other person before you, right? And that's the same here in the Amana colonies. So this landscape, I had to be taught how to see this, right? I just walked in and like, I maybe would have thought, that's weird. There's no like giant, statuary to the rich guy in town, but I might have just glanced over it, right? When somebody pointed it out. Oh, and then when you go and look, there's not family plots. Like it's not Williams and Williams, and well, it is because everybody's got the same last name. It's a small town. But you don't see like the family plot, right? Where, the wife is buried next to the husband. Everybody in this community is equal. And when you die, that's the great equalizer, right? So in this religious community, that egalitarianness is reflected in the landscape, right? So, again, that's not just detritus. It wasn't just something that people said, we're going to put our culture in the landscape and leave it there, right? I can't read it. You guys can't read it. But if you grow up in the Amana colonies and you go to visit your parents' grave or your grandparents' grave, you're learning that, right? Over and over again, that you're the same as everybody else, and that when you die, you'll just get buried next to that person, right? And it sort of reinforces those collective values that people had within that society. Military bases are very obviously coded landscapes. This is Fort McPherson. Oh, sorry, it's McPherson. In Kansas, it's McPherson. And here in Nebraska, they say McPherson. It's a linguistic boundary. All right. So military bases, right? Like this comes from like the old Roman legions and the way they used to set up camp, right? When they go into Gaul and conquer the Franks. So the way that we build military bases also kind of speaks to that conformity, right? And this you can see, I mean, it's just absolutely perfect. And I'm mostly just showing this one to you because I just got beautiful pictures of it, right? The other wild thing that this does, if you've seen a military cemetery like this, what's like one of the visual effects that this has on you? Like if I were to change it up and like, put different headstones, I don't want to draw on somebody's headstone. I just thought twice about it. Oh, and I don't have a whiteboard here. I'm glad I didn't do that. I normally have my screen on a whiteboard. I can draw on my map. That's a bummer I can't. Yeah, what would happen if I put like a big cross or a statue in the middle of there? What would that do visually to that field?
Stick out.
It'd stick out, right? But when it's all the same like this, what does your eye do? It gets drawn to the back. And then what do you think in your head?
Wow, that's a lot.
Wow, it's a lot of dead bodies. That's a lot of soldiers dead, right? So even the construction of this one is meant to speak to us, right? Whoa, right? It's meant to speak about sacrifice, right? Or service and things like that. And it's meant to impress upon us the magnitude of that, right? So the way that this is constructed codes us, right? I mean, they could have offset each row differently and you wouldn't get that diagonal effect, right? But the perfect placement of those headstones produces this visual effect that makes us go, oh, right? And then you don't have kids running around in the cemetery and, running amok. Like it's wild, man. You can take crazy kids that are running through the mall and you can put them in a cemetery and they'll be like this. Right? It's coded into us how we're supposed to behave in a place like this. All right. So those are pretty obviously coded. Sorry, I have way too many cemeteries. Let's go do something else. Let's start here. Yeah, we'll start with our squares. All right. There's a geographer who used to be here at University of Washington named Brian Barry. He's famous within the geography department. Brian Barry did like very quantitative spatial economic geography type stuff, looking at like what people call milk sheds. Like in the old days, there used to be like a break-even distance where you couldn't have a dairy operation too far from the city because the milk would spoil, right? So we called it a milk shed, right? So Brian Barry did a lot of economic research like that, and he came up with this model. Anybody ever play SimCity? Yeah, all right. There's a way to kind of like quote unquote beat the game where you can max out all your scores and your city just looks like this flat geometric grid, right? It's just like you just copy and paste the city over and over again and you max out your scores because every police station is equally separated. Every school is equally separated. So everybody has equal access to education. And when I was like, that's stupid. Like I was the kind of like 15 years ago, I was on like SimCity blogs. Yeah, like comment on stuff. Brian Barry's model for the perfect like agri-industrial society, when he came up with it, he tried to find a real world analog and he said Southwest Iowa was the perfect match, right? I was from Southwest Iowa. I read Brian Barry's research when I was an undergrad and I was like, you see, it's proven where I live is the most boring place on earth. The counties are all 50 miles across, or 35 miles about. The county seat is in the center of every county. The county seat is about 2,000 to 5,000 people, and in about 5 and 10 mile increments outside of every county seat is a town like Stanton, which has 500 people in it. And then even farther away, you get little towns like Essex, which has like 25 people in it. I don't even know why they put that on the map, right? So like as you go away from the service center, the towns get smaller and smaller. And then in between, we get, you know, our regional service centers like Des Moines and Omaha, right? So this is like perfectly spaced out, which would have made Thomas Jefferson just like happy in his grave, right? It worked, except it didn't. So these perfect squares that we get, one of the things that Brian Barry's research said, like we have to assume a flat plane. Right? Like we can't have mountain ranges and stuff because then that makes goods more expensive. And so his perfect economic model assumes a flat surface, which is pretty much where my family farm is, right? And these hills over here, those are like the only hills. Right? The rest of it's just flat, right? So we know that it's not flat. We know that some places have water and some places don't have water, right? But these little squares that we see on here was the normative landscape of Thomas Jefferson. He actually sketched this map of the United States up in his study with a cartographer named David Hartley, and that map became what we see of the United States when we look up above. When we look at it from space, right? This was a guy who never went west of the Appalachian Mountains, but the idea that he had in his head for the perfect organization of society ended up being imprinted on the landscape all the way out to California, even up into Alaska, right? The squared states, right? This was all, he's kind of stopped right here, but then that blueprint went on to the west as America grew. So inside of our big squares, right, we have, I should have my county lines on. But the counties are perfect squares. And inside those counties are townships, which are perfect squares of 1 mile by 1 mile. And inside those are little homesteads of 160 acres, perfectly square. And inside of those are houses that they used to call the Swedish Foursquare. They called it literally a square house. You could order it on Sears and it would come in the back of a rail car and you and your sons would build it over the weekend, right? So squares within squares. Right. And Thomas Jefferson's idea was that, you know, if we want to build the perfect society, everybody's got to be created equal, right? All men are created equal. He was talking about white men, just to be specific there, right? But he said, if we make all white men equal and give them all equal 160 acres square of land, then egalitarian society will inevitably flow from them. right? And so the idea was to create the public land survey system. And that's why if you're anywhere between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, if you ever find yourself in Iowa for whatever reason, you probably won't get lost because it's flat and all the roads are straight. But if you do get lost, just take 3 left turns and you'll end up right where you began, because it's all squares, all right? So squares within squares. That was Thomas Jefferson's idea, right? Flawed as it was. Now the French, right? They're doing their own revolutionary thing at the same time. Right. In fact, like, you know, there's this the chip on our shoulder, right? Whenever French people do something cool or eat good food, Americans are like, well, we have fried potatoes too, and we call them French fries. So yeah, the American Revolution in a lot of ways kind of cribbed from the French. The French were like, you know, liberty and freedom, and Americans were like, yeah, but we're gonna do it our way. So the French were going through their revolution, right? They were talking about freedom and egalitarianness, about democracy. And the French devised a different system of surveying the land, right? Because at the time, we're talking about the late 1700s, early 1800s, the primary mode of transportation was by water, right? Especially for Western European people, their cultures were built on rivers in a humid climate that always stay at the same level. Like, you guys hear the headlines from Germany when they go through a drought and like the river drops below a certain level, they freak out. And I'm like, well, that's what rivers do, right? Well, where I'm from, that's what rivers do. In Europe, they don't. They're not used to it, right? So that's the primary mode of transportation. That's their environment. So when they come over to the New World, right, the French are like, let's make New France here, but only do it better this time. And so along the Mississippi River here, we're down in the bayous of southern Louisiana, in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And this is what's called the French long lot survey system, right? So they kind of had this realization when Thomas Jefferson was like, squares, squares. The French were like, dude, like, I think you're a little too much on the squares. Some squares might not have water in them. Some squares might have like a huge gold deposit, right? And the other ones don't. So they kind of realized the fallacy of squares. If anybody's trying to sell you squares, be like, no, I don't know about that. The French were like, well, what happens if you got a square, but then everybody owned squares between you and the river? You'd have to pay those people with the other squares to get down to the river, and then you wouldn't be able to farm because your goods would be too expensive because you're paying for transit across private property. And so the French said the true egalitarian division of land is to give everybody equal access to the river, right? This is sort of like everybody should get a little bit of the sidewalk, right? So we can all have access to the sidewalk. Everybody's apartment building has to have its own staircase, right, going down to the street. And so they end up with these really skinny lots, and their idea, and this actually fits with the environment really well. I was going to draw on the board again. I probably shouldn't do that. Big rivers like the Mississippi do this thing. They have a floodplain, right? And they actually sit up above their floodplains. Oh, I wish I could use the force on my blue marker. Yeah, right. This is water. So the water in the river actually sits up above the floodplain. And when it rains, right, and we get floods, the water spills out of the river onto the floodplain, right? Sometimes it'll deposit a whole bunch of sediment right here and actually create a new channel for itself, right? It moves around and shifts around, spills out of its banks. That's why they call it a floodplain, right? It floods. So what that means is that if you're right next to the river, that's what we call a natural levee, right? It's a little bit higher than the river itself. If you're back here and you build your house, don't build your house right there, right? It's going to end up getting flooded. So it fits with the river to do the long lot survey. And so when the French did this, they said, well, this is perfect because you'll have your dock right here where you can load your goods into the riverboat. You'll build your house right here on the natural levee so it's not subject to flooding. And then you want your farmland back here in the floodplain because you want it to flood. You want that sediment from the river to come in and improve your soil fertility. Now I'm talking about soil fertility again, and I've been talking for an hour, so you're totally going to shut off. So that kind of fit with the environment. right? And it fit with their ideas of egalitarianness. And so this is a landscape that reflected those cultural values, and its purpose was to make everybody that lives there embody those values and perpetuate them over time, right? So the idea is that if we build this perfect society into place, everybody will grow up thinking that way, right? That squares are awesome. And then, well, I want to live inside of little squares. All right, and we'll drive little cars that are little squares all over roads that are like long squares. Cool. All right. So the landscape isn't just something we put in place. We put it in place so that it does work for us, right? The landscape has agency. All right. Some other cool places. I'll skip over Mexico for now. So one thing that we're doing here by looking at the symbols on the landscape, looking at the organization of the landscape, we're trying to read the landscape, right? Like it was a book. What is the landscape telling us? And this is a term called hermeneutics. You don't have to remember that or anything, but if you're interested in it, I'm interested in old medieval stuff. Hermeneutics was developed in the medieval time when you had those monks in their monasteries. Paper was like really expensive and you couldn't just like order new paper on Amazon. So you'd have to like wash over, and it wasn't paper, it was usually made out of really thin sheepskin called vellum, right? They'd have to wash over it and then they would write and they would reuse pages. Right, so hermeneutics was developed as a way to interpret ancient texts, understanding that like if you shined it up to the light or put certain chemicals on it, you could bring back those images that used to be there. Right, those pages in those books were referred to as a palimpsest. Right, a palimpsest is like a layered page where we can see all those layers of history in it. Right, so hermeneutics comes from this study of ancient texts, and cultural geographers have used it to kind of as an analogy to how we look at the landscape, right? We peel back these layers. We see what's hidden underneath the stuff that was put on top, right? We look at that palimpsest and try to see all this historical layering. So Timbuktu is a real place. If you didn't know it, that's racism, you guys. If you take the place that's one of the most important settlements in African pre-colonial history and turn it into a metaphor for the middle of fucking nowhere, sorry, that's me. Told you I wouldn't do that. Now I got my aggressive, right? Yeah, that's like linguistic racism right there, right? So if you've ever used that term Timbuktu, right? I know I did when where are you at? Man, I'm out in Timbuktu. Could not have been a more important place, right? This was the thing that connected the Mediterranean world with West Africa. So one of the most important ancient cultural centers of the world. Timbuktu has also one of the longest records of continuous inhabitation in Africa. So there's been people living here for thousands of years, and you can see that layering in the landscape. This is the old souk, or the central core of Timbuktu. And it's mostly Islamic in nature, right? A lot of the buildings here, there's in fact the oldest continuously operating university in the world, Sankore University. They've been teaching students since like 600 AD here. Right, so there are some buildings here that go back to even before Arab times or Muslim times in West Africa, right? But most of this original core kind of dates from that medieval period on up into the historic period. And you can see the nature of the way the streets are organized, the way the buildings are organized. This is a really common feature in, the way I was taught in urban planning school, this is indicative of Arab urban planning practices. And what I've found out over time is that this is actually an African spatial organization. Right, so in the textbooks, they'll tell you that this looks like Islamic or Arab cities. The buildings are pushed out to the street, and that's reflective of public and private life being very separated, right? So, in many Muslim countries, especially for women to go out in public, you have to have chaperone, right? Or have to be, their behavior is monitored or checked in some way. Whereas if you go inside of the house, there are these courtyards, right? And so in the United States, it's totally different, right? We have our house, which is your very private space, and then your front yard and your backyard are kind of this buffer zone, right? Before you enter the public space, So when we sit on our front porches as Americans, right, we're sort of partly visible to the public, right? So you don't want to do anything weird on your front porch, right? The public can see, but you're also kind of private. So like people shouldn't be running up onto your front porch, you know, and kids playing baseball in your front yard, right? It's sort of this public-private buffer that we have, right? Whereas in Islamic cities, that there was no buffer, right? You go inside of the courtyard and women can go around uncovered, right? When they're around family, when they're around close friends, right? So there's not really that buffer between public and private. It's a very stark division. And you see that reflected in the way that the cities are built, right? Now, why did I say this is actually something that comes from early African civilization? Well, because the idea of enclosure is really central to early African urbanization. Oh gosh, and I want to show you Great Zimbabwe right now. But this is on the edges of the city, and this is really a way of living with the land that harkens back to pre-Islamic African civilization. And so this is how people will live out in the countryside, right? You may have your house or even a collection of houses inside of a series of nested enclosures, right? And if you think about developing cities in Africa where human civilization arose alongside large animals, when humans left Africa, like the large animals had no defenses. They kind of got murdered everywhere, right? We extincted everything that had big teeth around the world. But in Africa, humans evolved there, right? So the things with big teeth are like, yeah, we've been messing with these guys for a long time, right? So human civilization in Africa has to evolve with that pressure. And so what we see is enclosure as the primary form of spatial organization, using acacia thorns to make fences, right? To keep animals out. And so what we see over time, right, 15,000 years onwards, African civilization develops with this idea of enclosure. And then what I argue is that that feeds into Arab and Islamic urbanization. All right, and now since I've put that theory out there, I got to show it to you. Oh, well, no, I want Great Zimbabwe. There we go. So this is a early example of African urbanization here in Great Zimbabwe. This great enclosure dates back about 1,000 years. The migration of Bantu-speaking people into Southern Africa takes place about 1,500 years ago, between 2,000 and 1,500 years ago. And by about 1,000 years ago, Great Zimbabwe had established itself as this largest, most powerful kingdom in Southern Africa. And so this is their central temple complex, right? And as you would come up to Great Zimbabwe, you would be greeted by, right, the king would control everything that came and went from this city because he built gates, right? And there were taxes that were paid on goods coming in, right? And the Great Enclosure is a really remarkable and ingenious piece of architecture because to enter it, you had to go through this really narrow canyon, right? And the pictures aren't showing up on here really great. There's a really great photo of entering that. Yeah, so kind of like that, you'd enter in and it'd only be wide enough for one person to walk through. So an army couldn't come in, for instance, right? But then once you got through that, you'd open up into this large garden-like enclosure and you'd have large buildings in there. This is where the royal family would be. So there'd be ostentatious dress, you'd have artisans, right? So imagine the effect of that. You're coming from a neighboring kingdom, right? And you walk in, you see these giant walls manned by guards, and you walk into this narrow space where all of a sudden you're opened up and you see all this color in front of you. You're like, it's like you entered the library, right? You're like, I better be respectful here. And then there's a bunch of people standing around with spears, and you're like, okay, I really got to be respectful, right? So the way that the landscape was built, at least in terms of African urbanization, rises from the relationship with the landscape, right? And that in turn constructs or codes the way people look at and behave within that landscape. There's another example of this you can't really see, but Benin City, well, you have the Great Wall of China. Oh yeah, blah, blah, I'm not really a fan of walls, like historically or in the modern day. There's way more impressive stuff. There's a canal in China, which is older and longer than the Great Wall, way cooler than the Great Wall. But in Benin City, there's the Great Walls of Benin. The British, of course, destroyed them because they were central to the king's control over the kingdom of Benin. But they were at one time, it's estimated to be the longest and most extensive human construction of the ancient world. And it was built just like I showed you with Great Zimbabwe, right? Sort of a geometrical or fractal pattern that would control people's entry into more and more sensitive parts of the city. Okay. Oh man, I'll show you a couple more things and then I'll give you a little break. I told you I was gonna get carried away. All right. I got a really cool video of this. It's about 5 minutes long. I'll put it in my lecture notes so you can watch it later. But this is the Questlachaka suspension bridge over a river in Peru. This is an Inca bridge. It's been rebuilt over who knows how long, 1,000 years plus. The community comes out every year and collectively rebuilds this bridge. They gather grass. Everybody has a different role to play. Some people gather grass. Some people weave the grass into strings. Some people take those strings and weave them into giant ropes. And then some people braid the giant ropes. And then some crazy person like goes out over the rickety old bridge that they're replacing because it might fall down, drags the line over, and then they drop the old bridge and they start building the new one around it. The video I have linked doesn't really talk about it. There was a really fantastic PBS documentary. They spent about a half an hour talking about this and how the people used this bridge and the ceremony that went about rebuilding it to resist Spanish colonialism. They sing songs about the work that they do, right? They gather grasses that they use their indigenous words for, right? And the whole time, over 500 years of Spanish colonialism, they're being restricted from speaking their language. They're being restricted from practicing their traditions. But the Spanish couldn't really stop them from rebuilding this bridge. And so in rebuilding the bridge, they're relating with the landscape, right? The landscape is telling them what materials they can use, right? It's providing them with this big chasm that they have to cross to reach the village on the other side. So the landscape is really feeding into the culture and they have to make decisions based on that, right? And then they're also very clearly modifying the landscape, right? So they're impacting the landscape as well. And throughout that all, it's a way of maintaining those traditions, right? So think about the way that we interact with the landscape as sort of ritual, right? The ritual of, it was my favorite ritual. I come to campus and you guys all came back to campus and moved into the dorm. It's a ritual in our pop culture, right? Everybody has a story to tell about it. All the parents were here. Oh, it's great. I was in the bookstore and I saw parents buying all this UW gear. And I'm like, that's part of our ritual, right? You said it's a rite of passage. Your parents have to buy a whole bunch. They're going to become Husky fans, right? So think about how we act with the landscape and how that becomes a kind of cultural ritual that helps perpetuate our language, our traditions, our relationships with other people. Okay. So we learn how to read the landscape, right? And that the landscape does work, right? It's an agent. Once we put that in place, it continues to do the work of people generations later. Okay. Oh, what place do I want to pick on? Oh, let's drop in right about here. Trying to think of the most suburban place I can think of. That's pretty suburban. Littleton, Colorado. My wife used to teach down in Littleton, and I avoided Littleton, Colorado, like just like the plague. I mean, this looks pretty nice, but to get anywhere, you have to drive on those 8-lane wide roads that have a stoplight every half mile, and you're like, this is crazy. Not a suburban fan. All right, so the suburbs, man. How is this landscape coded? What is this landscape doing? Yes. Yeah, I kind of felt like there were kids. I thought this was a soccer net up front. I think it's just a glitch. Oh, no, there's something there in the street. But yeah, that's, I should say family friendly, right? That is the thing I was hoping you'd pick up on. We usually dance around it a little bit, but that's 100%, right? You imagine kids playing in the street, right? Playing hockey like in Wayne's World. That doesn't fall. That's really old movie reference, I know. But they're gonna make Wayne's World 3. Yeah. That's what we see, right? If we do like, visual association, like I show you a picture of the suburbs and like you're closing your eyes and you're seeing kids play in the streets, right? Is that because you grew up in a place like that? How many, like I made the Wayne's World reference on purpose. I was trying to come up with a more current reference of a movie where I've seen kids playing in the streets, right? But like, I mean, this is like, I can't come up with a new movie. Right? I was like, this is where they hang out in Superbad. That's not quite as old. We all hung out in the streets for places like this. At least those of us that grew up in suburbs, and even those of us that didn't probably watched a lot of American movies and TV shows where they played in the streets. And you might have been sitting there in your apartment going, wouldn't that be nice if I could just like play in the driveway, right? Yeah, so this is like been coded into our brains that this is where families are, right? What do you suppose that is? How is this landscape constructed in a way that makes it associated with families? Yes.
Big yards.
Big yards. Yes. Yards are where kids want to play. Yes. Who deems them safe? They were built to be that way, right? Yes, we're getting to it. Yeah.
There's no park benches, there's no like public amenities, so people don't want to stick around this.
Yeah, if you don't live in one of these houses, what are you doing here?
It's probably like HOAs and that.
There's not a place for other people, right? Yeah. What else don't you see that might be for other? Yeah, right back there. That's a sidewalk. I did subdivision plats. I fought with developers over this shit. They'd be like, "That's a sidewalk." I'm like, "That's a big curb." Like somebody's gonna park their dually pickup truck on it. Yeah, those are called drive over curbs. You see these, it drive me crazy. In Colorado, that's where they push the snow. And I was on a planning commission. And I'm like, why would you approve sidewalks that are going to be covered in snow half the year? And the urban planners are like, dude, people don't actually walk. I'm like, well, I walk, and I watch people with strollers pushing them across icy sidewalks in the wintertime. Yeah. Yeah. So point taken. No real sidewalks, right? Yeah. So there's really no there. What do you do here? I mean, I think your point's right on. We came to that conclusion because that's kind of the only thing that this landscape is about, right? This is only about a family living in that house. Is there a place for anybody else in this landscape? Where are you going to live if you're a single person? You're going to live in an expensive house around a bunch of noisy, snot-nosed kids playing around in the streets. If you and 3 of your friends wanted to rent this place together, could you do that? No. You're shaking your head. I did, but that doesn't mean you can. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
nothing going on there that doesn't, I think, show that it's more than, or it doesn't look like nothing.
Yeah, this is what we call single family zoning. Right, and it was made this way, right? It's very specifically made this way to be a place for families to be safe. Now, what they were supposed to be safe from is something that we're going to talk about for the rest of the semester, right? But this was made this way, right? It was constructed this way. And what was it supposed to do? Well, it was supposed to separate families, particularly white families, from everything else that was going on in the city, right? This was the American dream. And the American dream, what I'm trying to tease out in your guys' assignment, like, okay, picket fence, 2-car garage, but what else is there, right? The American dream is typically understood as that single family home in the suburbs, 2-car garage, white picket fence, 2 kids and a dog, right? That doesn't have apartments. It doesn't have businesses, right? So the American dream, right? It seems pretty clear in our minds, like, yeah, I want that, but it doesn't have anything else in it, right? It's got conspicuous absences of other stuff, right? When you're like, my American dream community, it doesn't have any pollution. Well, where's the pollution at then? It's got to be somewhere, right? I mean, we can't live. I mean, there was a food wrapper up here by my lectern when I came in. We all leave our stuff everywhere, right? It's got to go somewhere. Who's been to the landfill before? Yeah, all right, good. That's more than I usually get. I loved going. My dad had a old Willys pickup truck, and like we had to go out and crank it to start up, and that was the dump truck. We would take it to the dump. All right. Been to sewage treatment plant before? That's my favorite field trip. Sewage treatment plant in New York City. Have you seen that? There is a documentary on it I watched. They have an ecosystem inside of there because it's so humid. They use this like aeration style thing. Yeah, so they've created an eco. It's really gross because it has moss and like birds and bugs and shit in it. But like they actually digest their sewage through this like engineered ecosystem. It's fascinating. It's better than what they used to do, which was just barge shit out into the Atlantic Ocean and dump it. And the EPA was like, no, that's not cool. And if I told you the year that the EPA said that wasn't cool, half of you were probably born by then, right? Yeah. All right. Well, I guess it should go without saying, if you need to step out and take a break, do it. But I've went past my break time, so I'm just going to keep pushing through here. All right. So this is not as obviously coded as Washington, D.C., right? But it's definitely saying things and doing things. It's normalizing single family lifestyles. You guys grow up with people in your household that weren't your mom, dad, or your brother or sister? It's more common than you might think it is. I certainly had periods in my life where there were people that weren't related to me hanging around. So yeah, but this normalizes that, right? When you weren't living with your immediate family members, did you kind of feel judged or like you weren't living up to the American dream? Or maybe you may not have felt it personally, but you kind of felt like society is like, so, I mean, it's great that you live with your grandma, but like, when are you going to get your own place, right? It's sort of this cultural pressure that's created by this, right? So we would call this a normative landscape, right? It's telling us the way things should be. Just like Thomas Jefferson's landscape was telling us that we should all be human farmers living on the land, growing corn and taking the wagon to the market, right? That landscape was saying that. And this landscape is saying we should all be living single family lifestyles, mom and dad and the kids, right? A very heteronormative vision of what the ideal social organization is like. It's cultural, right? We can say that. But what is culture? If I had to say, like, is it a thing that you have, you born with your culture? Why do you say kind of?
route, but that way of being awesome thing is like your work with people and stuff, and learning. Like go away from what they're taught and like.
You can say you're raised with it. Yeah, you're born into it. Born into it. Yeah. Are there parts of our culture or parts of your identity that you are born with? You might learn how to deal with that from other people, right? I mean, think like your skin color, all aspects that you're born with, right? That's part of your culture. I mean, you'd say that these things are like genetic things that you're born with, but the way that we understand skin color, like I pick on the person with the red hair. I'm sorry. I have red-haired family members. When you were born, did your family go, "Oh, where did that come from?" There's all redheads. Okay, yeah. My niece is redhead, and my brother's got a little bit of ginger in his beard, but we're all like, "Where did that come from?" Right? So, like, as a ginger, you have to grow up kind of learning how to deal with that, right? Yes, you might say some things we're born with, but most everything you're kind of taught how to process that, right? So you're more born into stuff than you are necessarily born with anything, right? So culture is this learned, shared thing. And I say thing, my favorite cultural geographer is one of my geography heroes, Don Mitchell. He wrote a really fantastic book back in the 90s that was about agricultural workers in California picking strawberries and the resistance of farm owners to put bathrooms in the strawberry fields. Yeah, that's a workers' rights issue, right? It's also a food safety issue. Yeah. So it's kind of like a lesson of America that for years, people like Don Mitchell were crying about workers' rights and you need to do something about this. Advocates for migrant farm workers were yelling about it, but it wasn't until somebody got sick from a pooped on strawberry that Americans were like, we got to do something about this, right? But Don Mitchell, really excellent cultural geographer, and he wrote a book that I read in my first cultural geography class. It's called There's No Such Thing as Culture. Yeah, that's kind of a mind fuck to do to students, right? All right, we're going to talk about culture, but there's no such thing, right? What Don means by there's no such thing as culture is it's not this thing that we're born with, right? It's not like you're born and your family goes, hey, you got red hair and blue eyes, and here's your culture, right? Make sure you eat it all. Well, we actually kind of do eat our culture, right? But it's not a thing, right? It's the set of ideas, it's relationships, it's a lens for how we look at the world, right? So when we think about culture, it's easy to think about material culture. What type of clothes are you wearing, right? What type of music do you listen to? The food that you eat, right? These are all aspects of material culture. But the harder stuff is the stuff that's not a thing, right? It's the ideas, it's the values, it's the ontologies, the things that we take to be true, right? Just something that we accept as true. Do you guys have an ontology, a cultural ontology you grew up with? It's like a piece of wisdom from your family, like it's just true. No. Well, so here's one in our culture we often have. Well, we can have a good environment, but it's going to cost us. The trade-off between environment and economics, have you guys grown up with that one? Yeah, it's 100% not true. I have so much data and research to back it up. When you invest in renewable energy technologies, you actually create more jobs and more productivity, more GDP. But for some reason, people that own oil companies have decided that they would tell us this lie for 40 years that, well, you can have this or you can have that, right? Yeah, things that we just take to be true, like just truths that we have, right? Those are part of our culture, the way that we understand the world. All right. Where do we learn those things from? Where do we get our values? Where do we get our understood truths about the world? Okay, so did anybody go through like a rite of passage with their family? For you to go out into the woods somewhere around a bonfire and like, no, nothing like that?
Well, I So it's like, if, or different, like they have this kind of figure it out myself, but you can do my experience if you're doing.
With people around you, right? Comparing common experiences, right? So we don't have those like rites of passage necessarily that we might think of, like you'd have in a tribal society, right? I actually this summer was up in the Pine Ridge Reservation. We're swimming in a river, and there were several men that I was hanging out with that had giant scars right here, like just massive scars right on their pectoral muscles. And then when they turned around, they had big scars on their back. And I knew exactly what it was because I read about it before, but these were guys that had done the Sundance ritual on the Lakota reservation. And they pierced their pectoral muscles with bones and lashed themselves to a pole. And they have to dance around the pole and sing until they pass out and have visions. And it's a rite of passage. It's how you become a man in Lakota culture, right? And I was like, really pasty white with my dad body and no tattoos. Like, well, I never did anything cool like that to become a man. I just like got a mortgage and paid my bills. Like, what rites of passage do we go through, right? To form your identity in popular culture. That's why I bring up moving to campus, right? Because that's a rite of passage that a lot, like, you know, a good chunk of American youth can share as that common experience, right? Oh, I've done this. So what sort of common experiences, rites of passage, where we kind of learn our culture? Yeah.
Turn 18 and get a tattoo.
Turn 18, get a tattoo, yeah. Or turn 18 and do a bunch of other things that you could potentially do. Yeah, turn 21 and do some stuff. Yeah, those are some rites of passage. I didn't get a tattoo when I turned 18, but I bought cigarettes legally for the first time. That was pretty cool. Yeah, the road trip, man, that's the one I always think of. Where's been on a road trip with your family or your friends? Yeah. I mean, it's like National Lampoons, right? Did you go to Wally World? Yeah, the road trip, man, that's my frame of reference. I relate to, you know, half the people in my age group through what road trip did you take the year before you went to college? Right? That was like the Sowing Your Wild Oats field trip. Yeah, so it's those relationships, those common experiences. There's another like really main way that we're probably embarrassed to admit it, but we talked about it a little bit before. How do we know what we know about the world? Where do we learn how to relate to other people? Where do we learn about friendships? Oh my God, you guys, My Little Pony. TV, cartoons, movies. I mean, I thought I was a good parent, right? But you know, we got an iPad for my kid when they were like 3, and they watched My Little Pony and Backyardigans. We did a lot of PBS stuff. Phineas and Ferb was by far my favorite. I watch Phineas and Ferb probably more than my kid does. I'd be like, hey, after school, I'd be like, can I watch Phineas and Ferb? No, Dad, I'm gonna do this. Is it weird if I watch it by myself? I mean, think about all those cultural frame of reference. Phineas and Ferb go on a road trip, right? They build an amusement park in their backyard, actually. I remember that episode, right? So that's how we learn a lot of these things. That's pop culture, right? That's how we learn how to relate to each other. That's how we learn what styles are cool, right? We're part of pop culture, right? And you may be part of other cultures as well, but we buy the same clothes. Anybody make their own outfit? All right, you bought mass-produced clothing. That means we're all part of pop culture. You made your outfit?
I got paint on mine. I feel like I made it.
Man, that when I was in art school, I had all these pants that I would wipe paint on, and I just threw them away. And now I kick myself. They're like $600 for pants like that if you want to buy them. Like, yeah. So, all right. So that's culture, right? And we're talking about this link between the landscape and culture, right? These sort of shared values and ideas that we tell each other, we go through rites of passage. Right? Think about what that road trip, right? When do you suppose that becomes a part of the American cultural frame of reference? You go back to to 1804. Do you think anybody's like, hey, where'd you go on your summer road trip to? You know, when does that become a thing? Oh, yes.
When they started building like mass highway systems, they're doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it really, you can go a little bit earlier. The Lincoln Highway was one of the first cross-country highways, kind of 1920s through 30s. Really, as soon as they started building cars, there's this attempt to build roads, and you start to see published guidebooks of like, here's how you get across America. And back then, it's like, you got to drive on this gravel road, and then you go on this guy's driveway, and then the Lincoln Highway comes out, and that's a big deal. And then we get Route 66. Right, Route 66 started in the mid-century in the 50s and 60s, really. And then in the 60s and 70s, we get the interstate highway system. Right, and that's when everybody has a car. And you can look, this where I said I do research on movies and TVs. You can actually go back and look at TV shows and see when road trips become a frame of reference. Right, it happens in the 1960s, really. Right, we start to get this idea of a road trip. Well, the Beatniks. Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Yeah, they did the electric Kool-Aid acid tests, right? That was famous first road trip in the 60s. Yeah, some neuroscientists and artists from Berkeley decided to drop a bunch of acid and drive around the country in a bus. It's famous. It's the reason they made acid illegal. All right. So the landscape has to be there for that to happen, right? We don't get road trip culture without roads, right? So the landscape becomes this enabling feature that does work, right? It acts and it helps to perpetuate these things, even creates new opportunities. So there's this, I'm going to read you a quote from another of my geography heroes, who I also met. I got to take Ken Foote on a field trip, which was really cool. We went to Bleeding Kansas sites in Kansas. Ken Foote, his famous book is called Shadowed Ground, America's Landscapes of Tragedy and Loss. And he looks at like houses of serial killers. He looks at 9/11, right? How do we treat these places that have loss and tragedy? So he says, culture is a sort of collective social memory. Societies may have many other ways to sustain collective values and beliefs, including ritual and oral tradition. But landscape stands apart from these as a durable visual representation, right? More than the books that we write and the TV shows, which you can't find on the internet now because, you know, copyright. That's why I can't find a lot of my music on Spotify. You know, it was old stuff and independent record label hasn't been picked up. But the landscape is there, man, especially when we build it out of rocks and stone. Right? It's there to speak to people and to continue doing that cultural work long after we're gone. Right? So landscape is this really like unique part of culture. You know, we talk about language as this other most durable part. If you think about what part of your culture you carry with you, right? If you have to migrate to another place, you might not be able to get the clothes and the food that you used to back in your homeland. But when you get to the new place, you often carry your language with you, right? Because it doesn't go away. Next to language, landscape is this really durable aspect of culture. You can't take it with you, but when you leave, it's going to be there forever, right? Speaking to other people and telling them about that relationship. So I'll tell you a brief story here, as I've got to get to your side. When I was a kid, I used to go and cut firewood with my dad in that old Willys pickup truck. We'd drive to the dump. Right? A Willys like the early Jeep, so it had that cool cowl on it with the circular headlights. Right? So we'd take that old truck. It looked like Mater. It was like a green Mater. All my movie references are like 15 years old at least. It's really weird. So we'd go out and cut firewood. It was at his aunt's property. We lived in town when I was a little kid. And we drive the truck out to my aunt's woodlot, and we'd go, there's an oak tree would fall down or a walnut tree, and we'd go out and chop it up and put it in the truck and bring it back for a wood burning stove because we had a really old house and it didn't have heating or central air or anything. My parents were hippies. So we'd go out to my great aunt's woodlot and cut wood. And, you know, as a kid, I remember being like, this is a pain in the ass, you know, and I have to go out there and get dirty. But then as I got older, I started to appreciate it a little bit, mostly because my dad had traveled a lot for work And that was like one of the few times I get to hang out with my dad doing something cool, you know? Not where we had to do something, like, it's like, hey, let's go cut wood. And so we'd go out there and, I learned like really practical stuff. Like my dad taught me how to care and maintain for a chainsaw, right? And that, have you ever had somebody teach you how to care and maintain for a tool? Yeah. What do you learn? What's the other lesson you're getting? Not just like, oh, okay, you gotta grease, you gotta put oil on the chainsaw blade. What else do you learn when you're maintaining a tool? Yeah, exactly, right? Like it was my dad teaching me that you have to get all the, you don't just put your tool away dirty, right? And that's like a lesson for life. Whenever I get done working out and I'm all sweaty and I just want to go lay on the couch and watch TV, I think about my dad saying, don't put your tool away dirty. And I'm like, ah, God, I like stretch a little bit, take a shower, put some protein in my stomach, right? Because otherwise I'll just donk and I'll end up crashing. Yeah, so those lessons like extend beyond just caring for that tool. You learn to care for things that you own, right? You learn about maintaining things and extending. You learn like, I have things like I will never get rid of my truck. I could probably buy a new truck, but I love my truck because I mean, I'm proud of how good I've kept it over the years, right? And trading it in would just seem like cheating on it. So, yeah, so I think about like, how would my dad have raised me if we didn't get to go out to the wood lodge? Because his dad did that with him, and his dad did that with him. And there's like 5 generations of Mayberries have been going out into the forest and cutting wood. And I even take my kid back to Iowa and we cut wood and burn grass and stuff like that. Like, you know, try to do those rituals and traditions because honestly, I don't really know how to be a dad outside of that. I'm like, my kid's like, I'm gonna fight with somebody on social media. And I'm like, make sure that you clean the sawdust out of your chain. I don't know. I'm lost, right? So that landscape was like so important to me learning who I was, me learning about my family, me learning about, you know, taking care of tools, me learning about, oh my gosh, and all the, well, you know, this is your dad's aunt's sister's plate. And oh, you learn all the family history. So you learn about who you are as a person. Right. And it's hard to think about how that would have happened without that landscape. I mean, I'm certain my dad would have been a good dad without that. Right. And I, despite not being in rural Iowa, I think I did a fairly decent job with my kid. The jury's still out. They haven't graduated high school yet. But it's hard to think about how you would do that in a different environment, right? If you were taken away from that landscape, because you'd have your language, but like, how would I, you know, refer to the bur oak tree if I didn't have the word for that, right? If my kid grew up learning a different language, I'd have to learn all the words for all the plants that we have back in Iowa, right? So landscape becomes this really important kind of venue, right? And an actor even in the play of our lives. Okay, well, I'm gonna have to skip over a couple things here. All right, to end up. Oh, yeah, well, we're talking about the American dream. There we go. Oh, it has the camp. I didn't even notice the camper there. That's perfect. All right, and then leave your trash cans out on the sidewalk all week long, you know, because you don't want the stinky trash in your garage because it smells like shit. So make everybody else on the sidewalk, which doesn't get used, we've established. All right, so you guys learned all my pet peeves today. All right. So on Wednesday, we're going to spend the whole class period talking about the flip side of the American dream. All right. So you guys doing, and I'll show the assignment here in a second. You're thinking about what your American dream looks like. So as we're thinking about that, think about all the sort of things that are absent from that dream, right? The landfill, the sewage treatment plant, right? Where are we going to put all that stuff? Right. So as America is constructing this American dream, that's single family, right? It's playing in the yard, it's doing all those wonderful things. It's doing another project, it's building another box to put all that non-American dream stuff in. Right. And this is conceptually what I refer to as the racist box. So it's kind of an analogy here, but it hits very close to home. So if you can follow along, American dream is the picture we want on Instagram, right? It's the dream, it's the thing we want everybody to see. But where do we put all that stuff that we don't want people to see? So America built a racist box. When in reality, as we'll see tomorrow or on Wednesday and in the coming weeks, is that America built hundreds or thousands of racist boxes. Right? We refer to them as different names. We call it the res or the ghetto or the barrio or Chinatown. Right? But America built these racist boxes to put everything that they didn't want to be in the American dream. Right? The apartments, the businesses, the factories, the sewage treatment plant, the landfill that you don't see in this image of the suburbs. America had to put all that somewhere. Right? Everything that wasn't part of the American dream, they wanted to put in that box. And that included people that didn't look like who they considered to be Americans, right? And that definition is broadened over time. Back in the 1800s, it was only WASPs, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You couldn't even be American if you were Catholic, right? And gradually over time, that opened up. It's usually, we usually have to go to war with somebody in order to open up American identity. Right. But in World War II, all of a sudden that opened up even more. Right. We elected a Catholic president. Right. Jews and blacks and Hispanics are serving in the military together. Right. And so that definition opens up a little bit more. But in reality, that definition of what you could be in the American dream was very limited. And everything else went outside into the racist box. So what we're going to do in this class is in the first half of the class, over the next couple of weeks, is look at how America built that racist box. We're going to look at the practical tools that were used to do that. Things like single-family zoning codes, the lending instruments that banks use to restrict giving mortgages to areas inside the city where people of color lived. How was that box built, right? Because it got that way. It didn't arise from nature. Right? It was very specifically constructed to be a place where we don't have things that we don't want in it. Okay? So we're going to look at how that happened. The second half of the class, we're going to look at case studies. We're going to see the impacts that that has had and really the efforts of people to try to repair that or tear down what's left of the box. But if you think about this history, right? America built this racist box. We built the American dream, and the racist box is over where nobody can see it, right? In the middle part of the 20th century, communities of color all across the country, and in fact, across the world, stood up and said, we're not going to live in the racist box anymore. Right? 1968, the Fair Housing Act is passed in response to protests led by Black and brown communities. Right? We call the Civil Rights Movement. And that was really a movement of people saying, we don't want to live inside the box anymore. Right? It was about school desegregation. We don't want to send our kids to the racist box schools anymore. And America said, okay, right? And they opened up schools. But remember, Black kids had to get bussed out of urban schools to white schools and vice versa, right? So the racist box is still there. We just opened up the door to the racist box and said, you can come and go as you want, right? And then this wild thing happens in the 80s and 90s where white people are like, you know what? That box is kind of cool. There's historic buildings. What if we all moved back down there and gentrified it, right? And then the people inside the box have to find another place to go. So that civil rights movement kind of, effectively makes racism illegal on paper, right? But we never got rid of the racist box. It's still there, right? Those neighborhoods that were built for communities of color are still there, right? All the toxic hazards that were put there on purpose are still there. The vice and crime that was very specifically located in those neighborhoods. We'll look at examples of Chinatown, right? Have you guys watched The Wire? Oh, this is another old TV show reference. All right, well, it doesn't make sense then, so I won't do it. But there are places where police allow certain vices to happen, right? If I stand on the corner right here and start slinging fentanyl, what's going to happen to me? Neighborhood watch lady is going to get on the phone, call the police. The police are going to be out there. Average response time in Littleton, Colorado is like 3 minutes for a police call. How long does it take cops to come to your neighborhood? If you call about somebody dealing fentanyl, yeah, they won't come. Well, I'm assuming you live close to campus. There are places where police essentially allow vice to occur. They've written off parts of the city as unsalvageable. That's a very long history that goes back, right? Those places are in certain parts of the city on purpose, right? So this was all made and we never got rid of it. It's still sitting there, right? So that's part of the problem we see with, well, we got rid of racism. Why do people in urban areas still have lower educational attainment, still have lower lifetime earnings, right? Still have lower life expectancy because it's literally unhealthy to live there, right? Because we didn't really get rid of racism, right? The box is still there. And so this class is looking at helping us see that box, right? So we can pick it out and know how it was built, and looking at efforts to help repair that, right? So we can finally tear down that box and get rid of it so that people really don't have to live in these dangerous and polluted places. All right, so assignment up here, hot off the presses. I just finished it a few hours ago. The rubric, I'll talk about discussion in a second. I can't figure out how you guys are going to self-assess this thing automatically on D2L. I will figure it out. It's just not ready yet. So if you finish it before discussion, just hang on. I haven't published anything, so you might. Anyway, if you screw it up, it's fine. I'll fix it. Is this really me screwing it up? You see what I did there? That's called gaslighting. Why did you guys mess up the grade book so bad? Right. So here is assignment 1, project 1. And this is really, I think I should have 1.1 there. I'm going to give you guys a second piece of this on Monday of next week. So we're really going to be working on this project for the next 2 weeks. All right. So we opened up Zillow. We kind of went through this. Hopefully you guys are fairly adept at being able to navigate this. And take some screenshots. What I'm doing in the assignment here is sort of, I don't have students that have done this assignment before. So normally I give you an example of like, this is an A+ assignment. So this is kind of what it should look like, right? You're going to do screenshots of your maps and you're going to have some answers to some questions. So as I'm going through here, like this kind of, that's Massachusetts Street in Lawrence where I lived. It's very beautiful. I like being on that street. There's Golden, Colorado. That's the Welch Ditch Trail on Clear Creek. All right. So just kind of giving examples. This is the type of thing you're going to be doing, taking screenshots to show me what your American dream looks like. Right. This is called the snipping tool. I've got it down here on my taskbar. But if you go in any of your Windows computers, you can just search for snipping tool. It'll show you that app. I'm not sure what the one in Apple computers is called, but I know they have a screenshotting tool, obviously built into your phones too. Mine's usually the down volume button, right? Take screenshots. If you should learn how to do this, it's a really good skill, but if you just don't have the time, you can take shots with your cell phone and email those photos to yourself and then just copy them in. Like it honestly takes longer than learning how to use the snipping tool, but I've had students that were just like, I can't learn it. Okay, fine. Do it your way. Then you're going to use the EJ screen tool like we looked at in class. We're going to use this a lot more for part 2. So make sure you know how to navigate it because we're going to turn on all the data layers when we work on it next week. All right, and then do your reports. You used to be able to download these, and I can only get a print icon to come up now, and I wasn't able to download a PDF, so I just put instructions to screenshot stuff. If one of you guys figures out where the download button is, you can download the data tables and the other links, but these really slick reports and maps, we're gonna have to screenshot. But screenshot those and put them into your assignment. So what your assignment is gonna look like, I want you to answer the prompts, right? And you're gonna paste in your photos, your screenshots, if you make any maps, right, to show me about your American dream versus your American reality. And these are prompts. You don't have to answer every single question in there. Obviously, some of them are kind of dumb. I'm trying to prompt you to think about something, right? So don't take them too literally. Like if it has a car elevator, that's a really cool thing. But like most places aren't going to have that. So that's just trying to address like the general idea of this question, right? So, there are 9 prompts on here. You're gonna clip your screenshots into that, and you're gonna have a document, and you're gonna save that, submit it, onto the folder on Canvas. Please make it look nice, put your name on it especially, just insert a cover page, put a title on it, put your name on it. That way, when I look at it, the first thing I see is your name, right? Make it professional. Okay. The self-assessments on, it looked like everybody did those, or did Anna enter them manually? We talked, she said you guys filled out cards. All right, so she entered them, I saw grades in there. You guys didn't do the self-assessment on Canvas? Okay, cool, all right. So that will be set up next time to where you just go in I think it'll be in quizzes, and you'll go do the discussion self-assessment, and you'll just answer true or false, and you'll grade yourself that way. Let's see, before we leave here, I did want to mention, because I've been in contact with some people, there is something in the syllabus about alternative course learning outcomes, alternative assignments, and getting credit for volunteering. I am in contact with a group right now called Braided Seeds. They're a nonprofit group that focuses on getting BIPOC youth out into the wild, going on camping and hiking and stuff like that. I'm meeting with Ashley Shoecraft from that organization tomorrow. Hopefully have them come in and talk to you about what they do, or at least get you in contact so you can, start doing some stuff like that. I also went to the Beacon Food Forest, which is down south of downtown. That was fantastic. I talked to some people with that organization. They had a harvest fest last weekend that I went to. That is going to be a really great place if you guys want to get involved in urban agriculture. They grow food on public land in a food desert, and everybody's free to go and harvest it. It's awesome. I'm really hoping I can get somebody from that group to come in and talk to you guys. And I'm going to talk with them about how I can get some volunteer opportunities for you. You might be able to go out there and, help them with some harvest stuff, or maintain the gardens and earn credit for class. I will keep you guys updated on that as I talk with more people, but I'll put it out there to you guys. If you're interested in this stuff and you have something you want to do, I'm totally willing to let you break it open and come up with your own assignments. And if you volunteer, I want to give you credit for it too. All right. Thank you guys. I will see you on Wednesday.
Hey, going, Conrad. Conrad, I think you did. So can I look at art?
Absolutely, yeah. I have hesitated doing that at this level. One of the reasons I focus on these map viewers is I think it kind of gives people that don't have any experience with art, like, here's how you draw a poly, drop a pen. But it needs work with that. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I could do it on story maps architecture. It's like written prompts, right?
Yeah, the story maps I think are really cool because it'll just send a link, and then it's easier to share it with the class and stuff like that. Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Are you a geo major?
Yeah, I'm done.
Oh, so you're kind of like me. Well, you need this credit to graduate.
Yeah, they just wanted, I came from California, I had a bunch of semester unit credits that came up here, and count half of them. It's too much because your semesters. I put like a random credits that they can accept.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you want to kind of, wouldn't necessarily do like just this project. If you wanted to kind of make ARC story maps, we could kind of modify the others. The next one that we're going to be doing is photo voice, where I'm sending you out to either do social media short videos or take photos of environmental justice.
Okay.
But I was thinking when I was designing this assignment, I was like, this would be way better as a story map. I just think it's 75 students, and I don't want that would be all on my TA. Like, here, you have to have 75 students make story. But yeah, that's kind of what I would like as an ideal. So I'll have you be the guinea pig.
I'll make it look pretty then.
Sweet. Yeah, thank you.